On the morning of September 15, 2019, the peaceful community of Maplewood, Connecticut, was rocked by a shocking crime that would forever change its reputation. Police were called to the suburban home of the Anderson family, where they found a grisly scene in the living room. Michael Anderson, a respected lawyer and loving father, was lying in a pool of blood, a single gunshot wound to his chest. To everyone who knew them, Michael and his wife, Sarah, seemed like the perfect couple. They had been married for over 15 years, raising 2 teenage children in their well-kept home on Elm Street. Sarah was known as a dedicated mother and an active member of the community, often seen volunteering at the local school and organizing neighborhood events. Their life appeared picture-perfect, but as investigators would soon discover, there were dark secrets hidden behind the closed doors of the Anderson household. The first person on the scene was Michael's best friend and neighbor, Tom Richards. He had received a frantic call from Sarah, claiming that she had found Michael dead when she returned from a morning jog. Tom rushed over and, upon seeing Michael's lifeless body, immediately called 911. When the police arrived, they found Sarah sitting on the front porch, her face pale and her hands trembling. She claimed she had no idea what had happened, insisting that she had been out of the house for less than an hour. Detective Laura Bennett, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving complex cases, took charge of the scene. Her instincts told her there was more to this story than a simple break-in or random act of violence. The initial examination of the crime scene revealed no signs of forced entry. The house was neat and orderly, with no obvious signs of a struggle. Michael's wallet and phone were still on the coffee table, untouched. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It appeared as though someone had wanted Michael dead, and they had come prepared. Detective Bennett's first step was to interview Sarah. She was visibly shaken but cooperative, recounting her activities that morning. She had left the house around 7 a.m. for her usual jog, she said, and returned around 8 a.m. to find Michael dead. Her alibi seemed solid at first glance, but Bennett couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the investigation progressed, Detective Bennett turned her attention to those closest to Michael and Sarah. She interviewed their children, 16-year-old Emily and 14-year-old Jake, who were both at school at the time of the murder. They were devastated by their father's death and couldn't comprehend who would want to harm him. Tom Richards, the neighbor, also provided a statement. He described Michael as a devoted family man who had no known enemies. Tom and Michael had been friends for years, often spending time together on weekends, playing golf or having barbecues. Tom expressed shock and disbelief that something like this could happen in their quiet neighborhood. It was during a routine canvass of the neighborhood that a small but significant clue came to light. A neighbor mentioned seeing a man leaving the Anderson house a few days before the murder. The man wasn't Michael. He was younger, athletic, and seemed familiar. Detective Bennett's interest was piqued. She began digging into Michael and Sarah's life, hoping to uncover any hidden truths. Her efforts paid off when she discovered that Sarah had been having an affair with their neighbor, Brian Coleman. Brian, a 35-year-old personal trainer who had moved into the neighborhood 2 years earlier, was known for his charm and good looks. He was single, friendly, and popular among the neighbors, especially the women. Bennett had a hunch that this affair was the key to understanding what had happened to Michael. Confronting Sarah with this information, Bennett observed her carefully. Sarah's face drained of color, and she nervously clasped her hands. She admitted to the affair, describing it as a moment of weakness that she deeply regretted. But she insisted that Brian had nothing to do with Michael's death. She claimed the affair had ended weeks before, and that Brian was not a violent man, despite her protests. Bennett knew that affairs often led to dangerous consequences, and she was determined to find out if Brian Coleman had any involvement in Michael's murder. Detective Bennett's next move was to bring Brian Coleman in for questioning. When Brian arrived at the station, he was composed but clearly nervous. He denied any involvement in Michael's death and insisted that his relationship with Sarah had been nothing more than a fling. According to Brian, the affair had ended amicably weeks before the murder, and he had no reason to harm Michael. However, Bennett wasn't convinced. There were too many coincidences, and she had a gut feeling that Brian wasn't telling the whole truth. She pressed him for details about his whereabouts on the morning of the murder. Brian claimed he had been at the gym, his usual routine. He provided the names of a few clients who could vouch for him, but Bennett decided to verify his alibi thoroughly. While waiting for the results of Brian's alibi check, Detective Bennett received the forensics report. The murder weapon, a small handgun, had been found in a nearby dumpster, wiped clean of fingerprints. Ballistics confirmed it was the same gun used to kill Michael, but there were no immediate leads on who had disposed of it. Then, Bennett received a call that changed the direction of the investigation. A neighbor who had been out of town during the initial canvassing reported seeing Sarah and Michael arguing loudly in their front yard just 2 days before the murder. According to the witness, Michael had shouted something about the truth coming out and that it would all be over soon. This information suggested that Michael might have known about the affair and that there had been significant tension in the household leading up to his death. Bennett immediately returned to question Sarah again. This time, she was more direct. "Did Michael know about your affair with Brian?" she asked, watching Sarah closely. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting around the room before she finally nodded. She admitted that Michael had found out about the affair a week before he died. He had been furious, threatening to expose everything and file for divorce. He had even talked about taking the children and moving out, something that terrified Sarah. "He was going to ruin everything," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I begged him to keep it quiet, to think about the kids, but he wouldn't listen." Detective Bennett felt the pieces starting to fall into place. Sarah had motive, but she needed more to connect her directly to the murder. She returned to Brian's alibi. When Bennett spoke with the gym manager, she learned that Brian had indeed been at the gym, but there was a gap in his timeline. He had left for about an hour, claiming he had to run an errand. This hour coincided with the estimated time of Michael's death. Bennett knew she needed a confession, or at least a direct link. She decided to play the two against each other. She brought Brian back in, telling him that Sarah had confessed to the affair and that she was now implicating him in the murder. Brian's face went pale. "That's not true," he exclaimed. "She told me she would handle it, that she'd take care of Michael, but I never thought she meant this." Detective Bennett leaned forward. "What do you mean, she'd take care of him? Did she ask you to help her?" Brian shook his head vehemently. No. She just said she couldn't let him ruin her life, ruin our lives. I thought she meant she'd convince him not to go through with the divorce." Bennett knew she was close. She pressed Brian further. He admitted that on the morning of the murder, Sarah had called him, sounding frantic. She had told him that it was done and that she needed him to help her get rid of the gun. Brian panicked and agreed, meeting her a few blocks from her house. She handed him the gun, wrapped in a cloth, and he disposed of it in the dumpster. "She said it was self-defense," Brian said quietly. "She said he was going to hurt her, that she had no choice." With this new information, Bennett had enough to arrest Sarah Anderson. She was taken into custody and charged with the murder of her husband. During her interrogation, Sarah broke down, admitting that she had shot Michael after he threatened to expose her affair and take the children away. She claimed it was in a moment of desperation, that she hadn't meant to kill him. "He was going to destroy everything," she sobbed. "I just wanted to scare him, to make him stop." The case against Sarah was solid, but Bennett couldn't help but feel there was something more to the story, something they were still missing. With Sarah Anderson in custody, Detective Bennett was confident the case was nearly closed. But something didn't sit right with her. Sarah's confession had tied up most of the loose ends, but there were still questions about the exact sequence of events. Had Sarah truly acted alone? Was the murder really a moment of desperation, or was it planned? The forensic team continued combing through the evidence, and soon another key detail emerged. A set of partial footprints had been found in the back garden, leading away from the house. These prints didn't match Michael, Sarah, or anyone who lived in the home. This revelation led Bennett to re-examine the possibility that someone else had been at the house that morning, even after Sarah claimed she had killed Michael in a moment of rage. As Bennett pressed forward, she focused on Brian Coleman's involvement. His claim that Sarah had acted alone and only called him after the murder didn't quite add up. Bennett decided to confront him one more time, this time armed with the new forensic evidence. She showed Brian the photographs of the footprints and his face immediately fell. "Look," Brian started, his voice shaking. "I didn't know what she was going to do that morning. I swear, I didn't plan any of this." Bennett remained silent, letting him talk. "I was there, okay? I went to the house after she called me. She was freaking out, saying Michael was going to ruin her life, and she couldn't let it happen. But she said she just wanted to scare him, not kill him." Bennett raised an eyebrow. "So you were there when it happened?" Brian hesitated, his hands trembling as he fumbled over his words. "Yes, I was there, but I didn't kill him. She did. I swear, I didn't pull the trigger." Detective Bennett knew she had the final piece of the puzzle. Brian had been present when the murder occurred, and while he hadn't fired the fatal shot, his involvement was much deeper than he had originally let on. He had been Sarah's accomplice, a silent witness to the entire crime. As Brian continued his confession, it became clear what had truly happened. On the morning of the murder, Sarah had lured Michael into a confrontation. She told him she wanted to talk, to try and convince him to keep quiet about the affair. But Michael, furious and feeling betrayed, refused. He had threatened to take the children and expose Sarah's affair to everyone, destroying her carefully curated life. In a panic, Sarah had called Brian to come over. When he arrived, the argument between Sarah and Michael had already escalated. Michael had been yelling, accusing Sarah of ruining their family and threatening to leave with the kids. Desperate and afraid, Sarah grabbed the gun from a drawer in the living room and pointed it at Michael, hoping to scare him into submission. But when Michael stepped forward, daring her to shoot, Sarah pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and Michael fell to the floor, dead. Brian, frozen in shock, had watched the entire scene unfold. After the murder, Sarah begged Brian to help her cover it up. He agreed, disposing of the gun and trying to fabricate a story that would clear them both. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming, and Brian's presence at the scene had sealed both their fates. On the day of Sarah Anderson's trial, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution presented a clear, detailed case. They argued that Sarah had premeditated the murder, calling Brian to assist her before the shooting took place. The forensic evidence, including the footprints and the timeline of events, showed that Brian had been an accomplice, even if he hadn't pulled the trigger himself. In the end, the jury found Sarah Anderson guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brian Coleman, charged as an accessory to murder, received a 15-year sentence for his role in covering up the crime. As the trial came to a close, Detective Bennett reflected on the case. It had started as a simple affair, but had spiraled into a deadly game of lies, betrayal, and murder. The Anderson family, once seemingly perfect, had been torn apart by secrets that no one could have imagined.